quite a lot about, as a result of what my father may or may not have done during the war. I knew for a fact, for instance, that at the school I went to, like so many private schools that had sort of monuments to the First and Second World Wars, old boys who died in it, I always felt sort of terribly left out because my father didn't feature among the soldiers who had valiantly fought and died for King and Country, although my great uncle died 3 days before Armistice, was shot in Belgium. As a result, when I was a little boy, I sort of rather mischievously one day, when my father was on his travels, he was then a publisher after the war, went into his sort of sacred ground, which was his private office at home, and did the kind of thing that only kids really do, which is start ruffling through Dad's papers and opening drawers and all sorts. And I found two things which were ingrained in my memory for many years afterwards. One was a German Mauser pistol, which I couldn't quite understand what it was doing there. It was a sort of very antique-looking pistol. Obviously, as I subsequently found out, it was Second World War vintage. And the other one was, some of you will remember, these tiny little Minox cameras that subsequently were called the spy cameras, became very popular during the Cold War, but in fact were invented by the Germans, and then we copied them, and then the Russians copied them, and then everyone was using them. They took photographs of documents and were very discreet in the way you could take them. And then as I grew up, of course, I sort of coincided with the first James Bond films, and Daddy taking me to see Bond. He always insisted on, I remember going to see Dr. No, my first sort of sense of sex, seeing Ursula Andress coming out of the Caribbean. That's what I remember more than anything, but then becoming more caught up in the fancy that maybe my father was a James Bond. But really the sort of truth of my father, the total truth of my father, I only really discovered after he died, when I started investigating the Second World War and that period in Madrid, which was very underwritten really. And halfway through my inquiries, I got a sort of phone call from someone not many miles away from the intelligence services saying, there's 2 great big bundles of classified stuff on your father during the Second World War. Would you like to look at them before they're declassified and transferred to the National Archives? And there was really the story of my father, up to all sorts of skullduggery really, with people like Kim Philby as head of the Iberian section, Anthony Blunt, part of MI5 at the time, keeping a watch on the Spanish embassy in London, and all sorts of other crazy characters. So that's a long way of answering your question.
And just briefly, what had been his brief? What was his role in Madrid at the time?
Well, like again, so many of his generation. He was really brought into the war as an amateur. He was 31, 30, turning 31. He was originally interviewed by. He describes it in a little memoir which I came across by a special forces guy, and was told how to cut the throat of an enemy prisoner. Decided that wasn't quite his beat. So he ended up being initially recruited by the Ministry of Information, which some of you will know was a sort of propaganda arm of the intelligence services. He actually brought in Graham Greene, a friend of his from publishing, pre-war publishing days, into the Ministry of Information. They both worked there together for several months. Greene, as I'm sure some of you will know, then went on to work for MI6 in Africa. And my father was posted to the British Embassy in Madrid undercover as press attaché.
An extremely forgettable detective novel, including one in 1938 called The Milliner's Hat Mystery, which contained, buried deep inside it, a strange scene where a body is found in a barn. And on close investigation by Inspector Richardson, it's discovered that all his papers are false and the body is not what it purports to be. Now, this novel was forgotten by absolutely everybody, except Ian Fleming, who was a naval, he was in naval intelligence at the time, and he wrote up a memo in 1939, which contained all sorts of mad ideas for bamboozling the enemy, including such extraordinary notions as planting false stories in the Times, as if. And Chumley was an RAF officer who was seconded to MI5, who effectively managed to bulldoze this idea through the sort of top brass of British intelligence, namely the 20 Committee, which was responsible for firing off double agents back into occupied Europe. And very slowly this bizarre idea was put into action. It proved to be, you would have thought during the Second World War, finding a dead body would be comparatively easy. In fact, it was extremely difficult to find the right sort of dead body. Until they managed to recruit a man with the splendidly Dickensian name of Sir Bentley Purchase, who was the coroner of St Pancras, who'd done a certain amount of work for MI5 in the past, who was only too delighted to keep an eye open for the right sort of body. And so between them, they managed to obtain the body of a man called Glyndwr Michael, who was a Welsh vagrant. He was unemployed, he was homeless, he was penniless, and he was friendless and familyless, which made him pretty much ideal for their purposes. And they erased Glyndwr Michael from history and created a completely fictitious person in his place, who was Major William Martin of the Royal Marines, who then became the vehicle for this extraordinary German deception. I could keep going, but I won't.
Your own father. Is that a very difficult task to do?
Well, obviously it is, and you know, not least when it came to actually presenting the draft to some of my siblings and getting their approval. I mean, for two reasons. One, I think, you know, as I was saying before, this is a sort of a tricky area, an area that, as I realised why he wanted to keep quiet, the nature of his work. And certainly, you know, there is a rule to this day in intelligence services that, you know, operations aren't really commented on and agents aren't identified unless they identify themselves, and officers aren't identified unless they identify themselves, and you just have to pick up this whacking big official history of MI6 and quite turgid stuff, basically because it's all numbers and aliases. So it was difficult on that plane. The other side was a much more personal thing. I didn't want to turn this into just a rather kind of analytical, historical book about my dad. I also wanted to try and bring alive the human tension of that generation as war approached, and indeed how when war literally was upon them, and how this really kind of impacted on relationships, on friendships, on love affairs in an extraordinary way. And the other thing about my father that I had suspected was that prior to my mum coming along, that obviously there had been another woman in his life who'd obviously been very important to him. I won't go into the details of how I suspected that. But part of my investigations into that period was to do with identifying this woman and trying to find whether there was any material relating to this. Again, halfway through my researches, the other sort of golden nugget, as it were, that sort of brought alive the story for me was identifying this woman, realizing that she died actually coincidentally about a year after my father had done, and that her son had gone to school with me, so he wasn't someone I didn't know. So I rang this guy up. He was obviously quite surprised to hear my voice. We hadn't seen each other since school days. Many years had passed. And I basically, you know, I remember the conversation as it was yesterday. I said, Anthony, I'm researching this book about my father and the war. It would appear that your mum and my dad had a pretty strong friendship together. And I was just wondering whether you had any material which might be of help. And he said, what an extraordinary phone call. Only yesterday I was going through Mum's affairs, as he put it, in an outhouse. I mean, they lived in a pile. And there under her bed, I found this very old suitcase. And opening up the suitcase, I found about 400 letters, all written by your dad to my mum. And these were letters that range from about 1937 to about 1942. I mean, those of you of that generation will remember that people were writing 4 or 5 letters to each other per day. They were leaving letters around houses they visited. None of this sort of waiting for Amazon to turn up 10 days too late. Forget about emails. This was a generation that believed in writing letters, and these letters are incredible documents if you come across them, because they're not only intimate, but they're an incredible social record of the time. And what I found there, beyond the sort of very personal engagement between these two people, was this incredible sense of, as Churchill put it, the gathering storm, this extraordinary sense of cataclysm that was coming across Europe with Nazism on the one hand, and on the other, some of them feared Stalinism, and how this impacted on the relationship. And I mean, this forms quite an important part of the book, because of course my father, when he gets posted to Spain, realizes that this relationship is going to be put under strain. He tries to keep it going, and then sort of discovers that she's actually engaged or got engaged to another guy who happened to be at school with him. So that was a terrible revelation for him, which took about 2 years to get over. But luckily for me, it led him to meeting this very beautiful Spanish woman who he married during the war, without whom I wouldn't be here.
Ian Fleming, Somerset Maugham, have all been spies themselves. They've all done it. And so this led me to think that perhaps actually the act of espionage, when you get involved in the intelligence world, you are in a way writing a novel. You are creating a parallel, false universe and trying to lure the enemy, and indeed sometimes your own colleagues, into it, which is precisely, of course, what novelists do. I did once say this to Stella Rimington when she was head of MI5, and got rather a kind of sharp response from her. And then the first thing she did when she stopped being head of MI5 was to start writing novels. And now she's chairman of the Booker Prize, I see. So it seems to me that one of the things that spies can't resist doing is kind of both fictionalising their own lives while they are spies, and indeed afterwards. But I was going to follow up on one other thing that Jimmy said, which I think is absolutely right. One of the great pleasures of writing about this period in history is the real granular richness of the record. Not just letters and diaries, although most people kept those, but it was an intensely literate war. Everybody was exchanging memories, and particularly when you get into the declassified archives, it's astonishing just how much detail there is in there. If there is an interrogation, it is minute by minute by minute. If there is a telephone call, every single word in the telephone call is recorded, which allows you to create a kind of, it's not quite a novelist's technique, but you can bore right down into the material and write every day as it happens. So you have that lovely thing, if you're a non-fiction writer, of being able to say, if the sun is shining, you can write the sun was shining, and you know that you're telling the truth. You're not violating reality at all, which is one of the great things about this period.
I'm sure Ben would agree with me. I mean, he was making this very important point right at the beginning about this extraordinary kind of interchange between journalism, history, novel, fiction, fact. I think what Ben, correct me if I'm wrong, what attracts us to writing about intelligence, whether it's in novel form or in history, which almost becomes a novel, is because intelligence has all the extremes of the human dimension within it. I mean, it's a point that Le Carré has made before.